I think the attack that we've seen in Nairobi in the past week is clearly one of great significance for Al-Shabaab. It demonstrates the group still has a capacity to launch attacks across the border, quite sophisticated attacks across the border involving a large number of people, involving clearly a lot of planning. I think at this moment in time it's not clear how much this was an operation that Al-Shabaab had undertaken with support of other groups. However, what we do know is in the tactical approach that Al-Shabaab deployed in this particular event is one that jihadist groups have been veering towards for some time. In particular, they saw the success of the Mumbai attack from 2008 as an example of how an effective terrorist operation could be carried out, with a well-trained group of guys taking over sites that they would then drag out into a protracted hostage situation, which will play out on our television screens. This sort of example, in some ways, we can see was maybe emulated earlier this year in North Africa, when Belmokhtar's brigades took over the In Amenas hydrocarbon site in Algeria. Again, they went in there and they seemed to take hostages and were potentially planning a prolonged operation before the Algerian government shut it down. What we can see here is that Shabaab have clearly taken this sort of approach and decided to deploy it in Kenya, in Nairobi. And it's presented the Kenyan authorities with a very difficult situation, because you have a very dynamic situation of a group of guys who have clearly done some reconnaissance and preparation to take over this site. You have the hostages who get caught up in the background. You have a very sort of dynamic and fluid situation with a lot of uncertainty about what exactly you're facing. And then on top of this, you have the world's media watching very attentively. So I think this presents it has presented the Kenyan authorities with a particular problem, but it does raise bigger problems or bigger questions for other countries in trying to prepare to counter a similar sort of event. I think that it remains very unclear to what degree there may or may not have been Westerners or foreigners involved in the cell that was involved in the attack in Westgate. However, within the context of Al-Shabaab more broadly, the phenomenon of foreigners showing up in their attack planning would not be that surprising. We have seen a number of instances where Al-Shabaab has used some of the many Westerners who are drawn to its ranks in their operations. For example, earlier this year in Mogadishu, a group tried to take over the Supreme Court. And in doing this, one of the individuals involved was a Canadian Somali. We've also seen previously the group has used Danish, American and British suicide bombers in operations within the country. It's also unclear to what degree there may or may not have been foreigners involved in Al-Shabaab's 2010 attack in Kampala against people watching the World Cup. So I don't think the phenomenon of foreigners showing up in Al-Shabaab attack planning is necessarily that new. I think the question that everyone seems to be really focusing around is whether this mythical woman, Samantha Luthwaite, a British convert who was married to one of the July 7 bombers, was in fact involved in the cell or not. At this point, it is simply not clear whether she was necessarily involved in this particular operation. I think in terms of the target choice by the group, I think clearly a mall like this was a target. It's a prominent site in the middle of Nairobi that, by the fact of being a mall where people are trying to sell things, has to be a relatively open space. But hence this is one that makes it more dangerous or a softer target for terrorists seeking to wreak havoc. They know that in targeting this sort of an installation, they will find clearly prominent and wealthy Kenyans, and they will also find Westerners. And in targeting Westerners, this is bringing their cause to a bigger attention. I think if we look at the past weekend, where we had quite horrible bombings in Iraq, killing somewhere in the region of 60 or 70 people at a Shiite funeral, and in Pakistan, where we saw a bombing against a Christian church that killed some 60 or so people as well. These were substantial incidents where a lot less attention was given. However, for the groups, when they in choosing a target like this, where they know it is likely to find Westerners, they know they're going to attract more attention. In part it is because they would like to strike the far enemy and punish the United States and the West for their support of the local governments, and for, in this particular case, for attacking Al-Shabaab, but also because they know that in striking Western targets, they know they will get the media attention that they seek and therefore publicize their message. Looking at this particular operation within the context of Al-Shabaab in particular, it's difficult to know exactly what this means for the broader group. I think it may be a little premature to say that this attack is evidence of the group being in its last breaths or something. This was a fundamentally quite complicated and sophisticated attack that they were able to carry out, and that was very successful, involving a substantial cadre of people who obviously had done a substantial amount of reconnaissance beforehand, who had obviously planted weapons that they were then able to use during the operation. This requires a whole infrastructure behind them, and therefore requires a certain amount of preparation. So I think to consider this attack evidence of the group's somehow decline, I'm not sure is correct. I think the bigger question is what this means within the broader context of the group and the fact that it's been undergoing something of a leadership struggle recently. We've seen that Ahmed Ali Godani, or Abu Zubair, has sort of taken over the organization, sweeping out a lot of the other sort of leadership figures within it. And it's possible that this attack is his way of sort of stamping his authority on the organization and showing that, you know, he is able to lead an effective organization here. That is in part appealing to Al-Qaeda's broader goals of attacking the West, and he himself has been at the forefront of trying to get Al-Shabaab part of the Al-Qaeda fold, but at the same time in punishing their local enemy Kenya, who has been involved in trying to push them out of Somalia. I think it's a little early to do sort of forensic examinations of the Kenyan authorities' response in this particular incident. They were dealing with a very difficult and dynamic situation, and we simply don't know all the details of what was happening. However, it does seem to be that there was a certain lack of clarity from their perspective. We did hear repeatedly over the past few days that the event had been brought to a close, only to then discover that it sort of dragged on further. We've also been getting mixed messages on the composition of the attackers from different branches of the government. But I think more broadly this does paint a bigger picture for Western countries who have interests overseas, or in particular countries like this, like in Kenya with the United Kingdom. The problem of countering terrorism overseas is something that I think we've seen is going to be an increasing phenomenon, an increasing problem for Western governments. As we've seen the Al-Qaeda's threat sort of disaggregate, if you will, from being a very monolithic entity that was directed out of Afghanistan, Pakistan, tending to direct its attack towards the West, we've seen it sort of break up, or we've seen it subdivide into many different regions where you have different regional affiliates of Al-Qaeda that sort of latch onto the ideas and that trumpet the ideas to varying degrees of volume, to varying volumes. And what we've seen is that as these groups have sort of regionalized more, their targeting tends to have become a lot more regionalized as well. So they're focused much more on local targets. However, it does increasingly seem, and we can see this over the past year in particular, in the In Amenas incident in Algeria, in the scare in August in Yemen, and now this incident in Nairobi, that these regional terrorist groups are still very eager to target Western targets. And the problem for Western policymakers is, how is it that you can engage with local authorities to clearly protect your interests and your nationals that are in these countries without sort of trying to take over the local security apparatus. And so this is why countering terrorism overseas in its many forms, be it in terms of supporting local authorities to develop security countermeasures, or in terms of trying to address some of the underlying issues and to look at sort of countering violent extremism and the spread of radical ideas. This whole battlefield has moved in some ways from being one that is still a concern at home, but is increasingly one which has to be projected abroad as well. And so understanding this dynamic is clearly going to be where I think the locus of countering terrorism thinking is going to be for the next couple of years.